So those are the three aspects of what scientism is. And now we're going to the history real quick. And the reason I'm trying to go so fast is because I want to leave a lot of room for discussion because we don't have much time. The subject that I'm teaching you guys, I learned myself for several years. So I'm giving you as much information as I can within this period of time so that we can have open discussion and really go through these things and flesh them out. So life of scientism. Now we're going to go into the history. And I think you guys are going to really find this fascinating because I love the history of science and history of philosophy in general, because it tells you a lot about how we think and how we got to where we were or where we are today. So let's start with another awesome graphic. Boom, boom. And this guy named Friedrich Hayek died in 1992, sociologist, also philosopher. And he was the first one to really coin what scientism was. He noticed there was a big trend. Should I answer this question? I will answer that later, Brother Mohammed. Don't worry, I'll get to you. Okay, so Friedrich Hayek was really the one to kind of crystallize the definition of scientism. You don't have to write all this down, but if you want to, that'd be great. I don't know how fast you guys are typing. I'm pretty good at it. It's because all I do is sit at a desk all day. Okay, so though scientism is believed to have been understood and practiced in some form since the 17th century by the French, and that's something you should note is that the French were actually the first ones to come up with positivism as well. Get to that later. The concept and the term used to describe it was said to have been crystallized by the sociologist Friedrich Hayek. And I quote him, "From the counter-revolution of science studies of the abuse of reason," he states, "it needs scarcely be emphasized that nothing we shall have to say is aimed against the methods of science in their proper sphere or intended to throw the slightest doubt on their value. But to preclude any misunderstanding on this point, we shall, wherever we are concerned, not with the general spirit of disinterested inquiry, but with slavish imitation, the method and language of science, speak of scientism or than scientific prejudice." I'll explain all this later, don't worry. It should be noted that in the sense in which we shall use these terms, they describe, or of course, an attitude which is decidedly unscientific in the true sense of the word, since it involves a mechanical and uncritical application of habits of thoughts to fields different from those in which they have been formed. Okay, translation. What he's saying here is that during his time, there was a trend in which people were taking the natural sciences, okay, such as the theory of evolution, and applying it to fields outside of the scientific realm, such as sociology, which Friedrich Hayek was a part of, and history. So there were actually people who were coming up with theories of history based on evolution. Okay, things like that. People coming up with concepts, such as the French at the time during the French Empire, who were coming up with concepts about humanity. And a lot of racism was going on during this time. A lot of colonialism was being justified through the use of evolutionary concepts. For instance, Africans were seen as below everyone else. White people were seen as the highest form of evolutionary animal. Okay, and Friedrich Hayek was basically like saying, "Hey, no, bad idea. That's not how you're supposed to apply this." Okay, there's a big difference between, you know, my field of study, how humans interact with each other, how humans, you know, construct ideas and cultures and societies, and your understanding of the natural process of the world. Okay, you need to back off. That's basically what he was trying to point out. Okay, pardon my bluntness, but you know, I'm trying to give you guys a concise form of this. So that's what he was basically saying. So he's the first one to kind of point this out and say, okay, this is an issue, and we need to stop. Now, did other people see it as well before him? Yes, but he was really the first one to kind of really define it and crystallize it. I think in French it was called scientisme, but I can't do a good French accent. So let's move on to another interesting figure, Karl Popper. Karl Popper, British philosopher, philosopher of science, came up with the concept of falsification. You hear this probably among atheists all the time. Can you falsify that? He's the one who came up with this, so blame him. Died in 1994, but he was an interesting gentleman. Let's see what he says. Cyril Karl Popper, a contemporary of Hayek, would eventually become a main actor in a historical debate over the nature of science, which we will discuss later, mostly agreed with the former's definition, though he would admit to being a follower of scientism himself in a less applicable way. He said, "But if by scientism we should mean the view that the methods of the social sciences are, to a very considerable extent, the same as those of the natural sciences, then I should be obliged to plead guilty to being an adherent of scientism. Indeed, I believe that the similarity between the social and the natural sciences can even be used for correcting wrong ideas about the natural sciences by showing that these are much more similar to the social sciences than is generally supposed." So what he said was basically, I follow scientism to a degree because I believe that the natural sciences and the social sciences can interact. He was less of a follower of scientism than what he admitted. Somebody who was a follower of scientism, dogmatic scientism, as we discussed earlier, would be somebody who sees all the other fields of knowledge, whether it be sociology, whether it be philosophy, whether it be even literature, and it can be governed by scientific principles. Whereas Karl Popper said, well, they can interact and kind of influence each other. That was really his sort of, he had a weak form of scientism. And, this is okay. But he wasn't dogmatic as many people are today. Let's go on to another gentleman, Bertrand Russell, one of my favorites. Died 1970. He was an atheist, but he was raised, I believe, was his grandmother or mother is Christian. He had a very high ethical standard. In fact, he was one of the first people, I think, if not the first person, to oppose nuclear weaponry. Yep. One of the first people during his time was like, we should not be doing this. It was very controversial for his period. And today you think about it, it's like, well, that's common sense. Back then, when they first came out with it, no. He was like, this is horrible. You should not be using these weapons. And people didn't agree with him. He was chastised for that as well. But he's an atheist. We often have negative opinions of atheists, but you have to understand that the fitra is still there for a lot of people, even if they deny it. There are a lot of people out there who practice an ethical standard because their fitra, is still there. It's still very much in them. It's trying to manifest itself. And Bertrand Russell is one of those individuals who I can say with a great deal of confidence, even though I didn't know him personally, but from what I could read from his writings and such, he was a very ethical individual, and I have high respect for him in that regard, because he was one of the first people, even before Christians were saying these things. He said we should not have this sort of weaponry. This is horrible. And from an Islamic perspective, I don't actually know the history behind the Islamic perception to nuclear weaponry, but I would assume that there was a lot of opposition to it because of how horrible it was and how it did not discriminate, against civilians. So yeah, an atheist, not a Christian, was the first to discuss this disarmament of nuclear weapons. Anyway, let's go into him. Purely dogmatic scientism, as we know today, had a humble beginning, and unfortunately, he has to be credited for this. He didn't mean to do it, though. At one point, many philosophers believed mathematics and numbers were synthetic rather than analytic. I'll discuss that. An analytical statement was that which was true by definition, whereas a synthetic statement was one which required verification external to the subject. So during his time, philosophers had this idea that there are two types of statements: analytical statements, okay, and synthetic. Analytical statements were just statements that we make that are true by definition. So, for example, a bachelor is a single man. And that would be true by definition. Okay, a synthetic statement is the grass is green. Okay, something like that. You understand? Something that can be verified, okay, based on experience. It's exactly the same as what Kant talked about, Ahmed Zishan. Assalamu alaikum. He talked about more or less experiences like he differentiated between the ontological and the phenomenal, meaning like what we experience is not the thing as it is. He would have made the same distinction between synthetic and analytical statements because they weren't actually challenged until much later. So yes, he did. Yeah. I don't know why I went into the big explanation, but yeah, it's true. So it is very similar to what Kant, actually is mostly similar to what Kant spoke about. So this is very important. This is why you guys should learn history. History should be your favorite class. Well, aside from philosophy, history should be your favorite class because it helps to explain not only where you are today, how you got here, and how we got here as a civilization, but also our ideas, how our ideas got here. Like, you can't understand Islam that much unless you understand, right, the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? You just can't. You know, I mean, you can understand the doctrines, but you can't understand the ethics or why. You know, you don't really have a true understanding of it. In the same way, the ideas that you're surrounded by today, you don't understand them unless you understand history. Like, you cannot understand the modern world unless you understand what happened in World War II, because the entire world that we have today is exactly a reaction to World War II. The UN, the United Nations, that thing that doesn't work, you know, that exists because of World War II. Right? You guys need to read up on these things if you haven't already. I sound like my father. Okay, anyways, moving on. So it went on to say, because each individual aspect of every mathematical formula could not be reduced to the sum of the whole or outside experiences, given the immensity of the calculations in question, they had to be synthetic statements. So according to many philosophers during Bertrand Russell's time, mathematical like numbers themselves were actual things. Okay, like, I know that sounds weird to you, but I mean, just like, if I write the number 3, okay, that backwards? Can you really see it? That is backwards. I flip it around. Okay, awesome. If I write that thing itself is an actual thing floating out in some ideal world. That's how philosophers actually thought about numbers, that they're actual things, like, you know, physical objects that we cannot seem to ascertain. They weren't things that you just wrote down. They were actual objects. And they were floating around in some ideal realm. So Bertrand Russell thought this was kind of silly. And he said he would find the solution to the problem of classical mathematics being claimed as synthetic by proving that it could ultimately be reduced to logical axioms. So he said, okay, I don't think numbers are these things floating around. I think that they can be reduced to logical axioms. I think if we broke down numbers, we would find out at the end of the day that it's all logic. All numbers are logic. Okay? And then he would prove that they were actually analytical, meaning that numbers were true by definition, not by being out there somewhere. And if you're wondering, like, why they were confused about this problem and why this is an issue, you're about to find out. In other words, he would prove that it was merely a symbolic relationship, true only by virtue of the definitions placed within, thereby destroying the claim of mathematics as being their own separate reality. And he did. In his famous work, Principia Mathematica, he actually proved that all mathematics can be reduced to logical axioms. And that is awesome, and I'll tell you why it's awesome, because his work was the foundation for computer science. If we have any computer programmers in here, the reason that you have programming language is because of him, a philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell. If it had not been for his work, you would not have C++ and whatever code you use today, because he proved that mathematics was reduced to logical axioms. So give him credit for that. He didn't mean to do it, but give him credit for that. However, by doing this, by proving this, he opened the doors for other people to think about things in a different way as well, in not so good fashion. In the same way, or the same vein, Russell opened the doors for other beliefs to be challenged that were considered to be synthetic, such as the supernatural, i.e. God. So now they're thinking, well, if numbers can be reduced to logical statements, what about everything else that we can't see and observe? Right? Let's move on. Next. This guy, we come to Ludwig Wittgenstein, died in 1951. The most eccentric person you will ever meet in your life, at least according to his friends and his own writings. He was also perhaps one of the most arrogant people that ever lived, but it was in a kind of a quirky way, a funny way. He literally believed that he had solved every problem in philosophy. after he wrote like 30 notes, 30 pages of notes. I'm reading, oh yes. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat here. So he believed that he had solved all problems of philosophy. And what's interesting is that him and Bertrand Russell were actually friends. And Ludwig Wittgenstein was actually a little younger than him. And he basically wrote these notes during wartime. He wrote them in a battlefield. Like when he was on his off time, he was writing these notes. He was a brilliant mind, okay, but he was very eccentric, very kind of crazy in his own little way, and very, very. You couldn't even argue with him because he was so like, "I am right," you're wrong. And him and Bertrand Russell used to be like complete opposites of each other, but they used to get along for some reason. Anyways, so he wrote this work and he tried to send it in to Bertrand Russell. He said, "Look, I solved all the problems of philosophy. Give me my PhD." And Bertrand Russell was like, "This isn't a thesis. It's 30 pages of like notes." It was called the Tractatus, and he denied Ludwig Wittgenstein his PhD. And then eventually Ludwig Wittgenstein was like, "Okay, well, since I solved all the problems of philosophy, I have nothing else to do in life," and he became a grammar teacher. And then after that, some philosophers picked up his work and started using his ideas. And then Bertrand Russell was like, "Okay, let's give this guy a PhD," and that was that. Now it gets more funny after this too. So let's read this part first. A young philosopher contemporary to Bertrand Russell, who goes on to advance the latter's work, concluded the following from Bertrand Russell. So he read Bertrand Russell's work, and then he improved upon it, and then he stated the following. Okay, let's see. Another question first. Are the logical truths themselves a priori because they too are analytic? What makes them so? A priori. We're not going to discuss a priori in here. This is more regarding like, it'll be in a future class. I might answer that one later. Okay, so let's read what he wrote in, this is basically his thesis summarized. The right method of philosophy would be this: to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. the propositions of natural science, i.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. And then always when someone else wished to say something metaphysical or non-observable, to demonstrate to him that he had given no meaning to certain signs in his propositions. This method would be unsatisfying to others. He would not have the feeling that we were teaching him philosophy, but it would be the only strictly correct method. So basically what he was saying is that nothing has any meaning, essentially, unless it can be empirically verified by scientific observation, by science itself. Okay, another question before we go on. You guys are really throwing really good questions at me. So let me read this one real quick. Can we import scientific theories to the Muslim world uncritically and teach them in our schools, or should there be a review to ascertain their compliance with the Islamic worldview? We will discuss that at a later point as well. I have prepared myself for all of you guys. You have no idea. Okay, my mind works like clockwork. All right, trust me, we'll talk about that. If your questions are in relation to the material that I have here present, please ask it now so I can answer. But if it's something that just comes in your back of your mind, like I want to know this right now, I don't care if he gets to it or not yet, please save it for a little later, and we'll definitely get into it. Like, I'm not trying to avoid your questions, I promise. But you really need to understand this part, because this is very, very, very important to understanding how people think today. Okay, so after writing this, the Tractatus, he got his PhD, and he basically reduced all statements to analytical statements. In other words, any statement lacking any observable evidence based in science should be rendered as meaningless, because statements can only have meaning if they actually point to something in reality. Statements are only analytic and without content otherwise. So he basically said that every statement that you ever make is analytic until it can be proven. That's it. Every statement you say, this is Wittgenstein, every statement you say has no real content, no real substance outside of its own definition, unless you can point to something in reality. Okay? That's what he said. So if you say something like love, Wittgenstein would be like, what is that? Like, what are you talking about? Where is it? Does that sound like some of the atheists you talked to today? Okay, let's keep going. So let's get to A.J. Ayer. All right. And he's going to be one of the proponents of a movement that came after Ludwig Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein influenced a movement after he made this statement, after he made these claims. He influenced a movement called the logical positivist. And one of the leading proponents of logical positivism was A.J. Ayer, and we'll get to Willard Quine and all them later. So let's go to A.J. Ayer first. A.J. Ayer was a British philosopher, one of the leading proponents of the movement known as logical positivism. He died in 1989. He was actually a very interesting individual, very quiet. Apparently, he was a ladies' man. I know that's haram, but I'm just telling you because he doesn't look the type. But he was a very charming person and considered a gentleman among many. If I happen to recall, I think he actually got into a fight with, who was it? Was it Mike Tyson? Not in a physical fight. I think he got into a verbal altercation with Mike Tyson. I'm not joking. You can look it up. Don't tell me how it happened. It just did. Okay, so apparently Mike Tyson was doing something bad, trying to impose himself upon a woman. And A.J. Ayer walked into the room during a party, and he said, "What are you doing? This is wrong." And then he tried to talk to Mike Tyson. He talked him out of it, and apparently they became friends. I know it's weird, just it's true though. So anyways, a British philosopher and one of the leading proponents of the movement known as logical positivism would carry on Wittgenstein's views, being the last philosopher to try and defend the following statement. So the statement he came up with was the following: we say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which he purports to express. So basically he was saying that no statement has any sort of meaning whatsoever unless he can verify that through some sort of like, some sort of, what's the word? If it can be verified physically through empirical observation. Okay. I have another question here. Real quick, for future classes, please give us some reading material before the lectures so that it's easier for us to understand stuff when you were talking. I apologize. I did send in an introduction for reading material. I don't know if it was posted on the website. That said, it should be up there now. I do apologize in advance once again to all of you. I was actually extremely ill a week ago. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but just bear with me. I had a minor heart attack last week, so I'm just kind of like recovering. I know it doesn't look like it, right? Yeah. That's because I'm so interested in the subject. But in any regard, I do apologize for that, and I hope that, like I said, if you have any questions regarding this material right now, if you need me to explain more things, please ask those questions about this material so that we can continue. Like I said, if you're stuck on something, just ask, and I'll do my best to explain it to you. Okay, so yeah, so that's what he said. In other words, a statement has meaning if and only if it can be empirically verified by science or is true by definition. What Ayer would fail to realize later was that this very statement of verification was self-refuting. And this is where it gets funny, because the entire philosophical school of logical positivism would eventually fall to pieces. Because the very statement itself, the very thing in which they needed to verify things, the statement itself that no statement has meaning unless it can be empirically verified, could not itself be empirically verified. There you go. It's done, right? Self-refuting. And throughout the rest of his career, he tried to solve this dilemma. It's like, well, okay, well, if all statements are analytic, and we can't prove them unless it can be empirically verified. But the very statement itself, the very claim of verification itself cannot be verified. Then what are we doing? Okay, next question. What is tautological? It means it's true by definition. It's just true. A single man is a single man. That's tautological. You see what I'm saying? Definitions in and of themselves. Something that is true by definition. It doesn't need any sort of external sources. Muhammad Zia, assalamu alaikum. This is a good question. Some of the mutakallim use syllogism based on pure reason to prove the existence of God. Since, according to Ludwig Wittgenstein, each proposition of the syllogism would have to be proven empirically, would this mean that he would reject any proofs for the existence of God? Yes. And this is what the logical positivists did. They rejected all metaphysical assumptions. Every single thing you can think of. It doesn't matter. You could put the teleological argument, you could put the cosmological argument. They looked at it and they said, it's not observable. We reject it. It's meaningless. So let's see what happened. After they all realized, now here's an extra funny thing too, by the way. I didn't mention in the slides here. Ludwig Wittgenstein would eventually reject his own propositions. He would eventually redo his entire philosophy. He would get rid of it entirely, and he would be the first one to point this out, that there was a problem. So after all these years writing all these notes, doing it during wartime and trying to get his PhD and saying that he had solved all the problems, he eventually, a couple of years later, he was like, hey guys, I was wrong. Sorry, my bad. And then he fought against his own philosophy. So that tells you something of how eccentric he was. But he was a brilliant mind. So let's see how this philosophy eventually got completely and utterly destroyed. It wasn't just because it was self-refuting, but it was something else. And we're going to go now to the American philosophers. And this is about the only thing I like about America, are the American philosophers in the pragmatist tradition. And we're going to start with an individual by the name of Willard Quine, who died in 2000. And in the American tradition of philosophy, it's very different from British. In a way, it's like they focus on different problems. In the American version of philosophy, it was more about practical things. What can we use? What can we do with this? You know what I mean? Whereas the British philosophers were more like trying to figure out issues of truth and justification. And American philosophers were just like, look, I just want something I can do with it. Okay? And you have to give them some credit, because the thing is, they really broke down what the problems were with this philosophy. So let's see what Willard Quine did. So despite the fact that the principle of verification was self-refuting, there was more to argue against regarding the logical positives' understanding of science and justification in general. Willard Quine, an American pragmatist philosopher of science, would eventually show that the reductionist view of science promoted by the likes of A.J. Ayer was ultimately a flawed understanding of science. Okay, so what is reductionist? He goes on to say, the totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs is a man-made fabric, which impinges on experience only along the edges. Okay, so before going into this more detail, basically, remember, the logical positivists believe that nothing had meaning unless it can be empirically verified. So it had to correspond with something outside, right? Statement corresponds with reality. Okay, so it'd be reduced. So a statement could literally be reduced into like the smallest format, unless if it could be empirically verified. So if I said, I have a lock on my door, okay, all I have to do is show you the lock on my door. Okay, that's it, done. You understand the statement, okay? But what Quine said was something else. He said, look, you can't do that, because statements aren't just understood by what they correspond to. There's more to understanding a statement or understanding something in general than just pointing at an object. So I'm going to give you an example, okay? A statement, I need to fix the lock on my door before I go to work today. Very simple statement, right? But it's really not, if you think about it. See, let me try to reduce that statement by asking a question. Why do you need to fix the lock on your door? I answered the question, because my lock is broken. I ask another question. What do you mean it's broken? Well, it's broken. It doesn't lock anymore. And I say, okay, why do you need to fix it? Because I need to protect my things while I'm gone. Why do you need to protect your things? You see where I'm going with this? You can't keep reducing it. It's irreducible. It keeps going around and around because within these statements that we make in our daily lives, there's more to knowledge than what it corresponds to directly in empirical observation. There's more to meaning than that. So here's a personal example. When I was living in Malaysia for almost a decade doing my studies there, and I remember I had some neighbors from a rural part of Nigeria. Okay, let me see here. A rural part of Nigeria, and they didn't have this concept of locks in their mind. They didn't understand what locks meant because, well, and I learned this the hard way. I went out one day just to go get some food. I came back and I found out that my door was open and some of my stuff was gone, like my kitchen supplies, they were gone. I was wondering why, and I found some of the kids playing with them, and I was wondering, okay, what are you doing with my stuff, And he didn't understand. He was one of the children of my Nigerian neighbor. He didn't understand, and this kept going on for quite some time. And eventually I confronted, his father, and I said, look, this has been going on. And, I started locking my door after that. But, eventually, I would unlock it sometimes and they would still come in and do things. And I thought, I just want to tell you, I'm sorry to say this, but, your son's kind of stealing from me. No offense. I know he's young. He doesn't know any better, but I just want to inform you. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. And he explained to me that the reason why that he's doing this is because in his village in Nigeria, the families there don't have locks. They share the materials. They go into each other's houses and take things and come out. It's normal. They even share the kids. And it's like, for them, that the concept of a lock is very alien. You know what I mean? So if you told them that statement, they wouldn't understand what you're saying. Because their entire culture is not based around this concept of privacy or private property. In the West, it's different. We have this concept. So in that way, that kind of gives an example that you can't reduce these statements to anything because they're within the context of a completely different system of understanding. And this is what Quine pointed out. He said, we don't live in statements. We don't live in facts that are, just there. We live in this whole web of knowledge that contextualizes everything that we say and do, right? He would say that, in other words, knowledge was holistic and contextualized based on the world in which we lived and understood things. So it can't be just reduced to logical axioms. You can't just say, oh, we found it, there it is, therefore it's all solved. Because it corresponds, our entire interpretation of reality is this big web. It's not just statements or words or letters, right?